moving things against a chemical gradient or a electrochemical gradient. So we have two different systems here. Both of those need energy. So here's an example of a primary active transport system. Here we're going to basically ensure a molecule is less abundant and at very low concentration within the cell. And the reason we might want that is because the higher concentration outside the cell might have an energetic process, but also might escape in the cell again because of the equilibrial constant in regards to going through another transporter that might make energy or might have a different function. So we're going to have a look at these a little later on, but this one in particular is pumping out S1 from the inside of the cell, maybe to change the concentration gradient or may change the electrochemical gradient. This is going to require the consumption of ATP to drive this little motor to both first attract, or the structure will attract the substrate, but then actually to push it against the concentration gradient. So there's going to be a consumption of ATP, utilizing that energy, that bond breakage from that that first phosphate bond to then produce phosphate and remain the anhydride phosphate bond on the ADP. So this is a process of active primary transport. Now, secondary active transport is a mixture of two systems. So we have this particular system here in now conjunction with the movement of the molecule back into the membrane, back into the cell that has the compound that has originally been moved out. So here we have the original compound being taken by the primary active system, consuming ATP to get that particular concentration out. Because now that we've established a concentration gradient, we can now use a co-transporter in the secondary active system to bring that back in, given the concentration gradient differentiation. But in this particular case, it also carries S2, which is at a very low concentration at the extracellular compartment of the cell. So we want to see this compound become concentrated in the cell. And what we're going to see is a selective system that will bind and transport S2 through, but only with the co-transportation of S1. So this one becomes the driving power to basically cause a concentration gradient, this time in the opposite direction, by taking a very limited S2 in the extracellular domain and bring it into the cytosol and be able to concentrate that particular compound within the cell. So again, we have this particular system that allows us to move this guy up, a uphill component, to basically be low concentration outside to high concentration inside. And if we want to have this moved out, there has to be another transport system to get this out. But we might want to be able to concentrate this particular compound into the cell, inside the cell for a particular reason, utilizing S1 and consuming ATP. So primary active transports, they use a solute accumulation and directly coupled to some type of coupled reaction, in this case, the breakdown of ATP. A secondary transport system uses that same system, the up and downhill component, and an endergonic transport system of one of these particular solutes, in this case, this guy here, the S1, to basically go with the flow. And this going with the flow will then actually impact a different solute that's usually in a lower concentration and bring it into the cell to actually concentrate that material inside the cell. And again, it uses a pump system to pump it uphill as activated by the primary active transporter, i.e. these two examples illustrate a coupled transport system. And so we call that a secondary active transport system. We can calculate the energy required for these types of movements of solutes against a gradient by using Gibbs free energy and some of the aspects that we have previously seen. This time, we're going to manipulate the equation to specifically look at the product and the substrate in regards to the movement of a particular compound from one side to the other. So we're calling C1 is the substrate and C2 is the product. So we can basically think about this in regards to rearranging this equation because we're actually seeing no bonds being broken in the standard free energy equation because we're moving one compound from one side to another using energy. So the standard free energy is actually zero. So when we actually get the energy for transportation of these types of molecules, it's directly related to the concentration on one side to the concentration on the other. And therefore we can work out what delta GT is when we have the gas constant and the temperature, take the log of the concentration in regards to the larger concentrational membrane and the beginning membrane area, which is outside. So this might be the outside the cell, this might be the inside the cell, depending on which direction we're looking at. And again, we can kind of visualize importantly by looking at delta GT, which potential way are we going to have to consume energy to either keep the compounds out of the cell or keep the compounds in the cell. So we have a spontaneous movement of solvents within a compartment when the delta G prime 0 is eating or is greater than that of 0. So 0 being the bigger number, I mean smaller than 0, so very minor and negative number. So the compartment from a higher concentration to a compartment to a lower concentration is going to be then ideally spontaneous. But once we reach those molecules equaling either the chemical gradient or the charge distribution across the membrane, we're going to see no movement of the materials going from compartment 1 to compartment 2. And in that particular process, we're going to see a no net flux movement, and therefore we get a delta G of 0. That is when the concentration of C1 is equal to C2, meaning there's no net movement now of ions, and therefore there's no expenditure of energy. With that in mind, at the equilibrial constant, we can understand then whether we're flowing molecules into the cell or out of the cell, and depending on where we're actually going to be moving that energy in the negative or the positive sense. So if there's a high concentration gradient inside the cell, and there needs to be a movement of those molecules through the lipid membrane, and there's a free transport allowed to do that, it's going to have a very require a no energy is going to be exergonic in regards to being able to be then utilized as a potential coupling component, as we've seen similar in regards to the movement of S1 in the secondary active transport system. Now we can also see this influence in regards to if C1 and C2 are going to be influenced by now a charge distribution, meaning we're not just moving things against a chemical gradient, a difference of C1 and C2, but we're also going to have to now contribute an issue in regards to the charge of that membrane. So in this case, the presence of a membrane potential can be influenced by how many positive and negative charges are on either side of that particular membrane, which then gives us, we talked about the battery cell in regards to positive and negative moving through a semi-permeable membrane. So in this case, free energy can change and can be involved in the sense of how the charge distribution then plays a particular role. So the delta GT, the energy to transfer one molecule from the other, might be actually hindered by the overall charge state of the molecule and its opposing charge state of the membrane. So in this case, we can add a particular part of the equation in regards to contributing to now the influence of the charge state, not just that of the concentration, but now of the charge state, where Z is the charge on the particular ion that is present. So it could be like a calcium 2 plus. We have a Faraday constant, which is 9.6.5 kilojoules per volt mole, and a delta psi, which is actually the membrane potential. And this membrane potential can be basically measured in the form of volts or in millivolts. So this gives us an idea in regards to if this particular delta psi is negative, we're going to be moving from outside to inside because the transporter of basically the cations into the cell is favored over the anion. So we're actually causing now a differentiation between the lipid membrane on one side and that of the other. Obviously, it is the true is opposite in regards to if the delta psi delta phi was actually positive, so we'd actually see a change in direction of that flow as well as inversion of the charge distribution across the membrane. So in a change in delta G for a flow down an electrochemical gradient is going to have a negative value. And for transportations against a electrochemical gradient, it's going to have a positive value because we're going to have to do work and have that system hopefully be coupled in regards to allowing us to do that. So we're going to have this particular compounding component, and that's why I talked about going down a chemical gradient, going down a electrical gradient, and going down a chemical electrical gradient. So there's three aspects that we've got to be aware of, because ultimately the movement of those ions as we change the charge distribution across the lipid membrane is going to give us an electrical potential or an electrogenic component which we can physically measure. And this becomes very important in nerve propagation and nerve action potential, which we'll see shortly. So how do we actually establish these types of charge distributions in the cell itself? We use particular pumps, and some of these are illustrated in this slide here, and we'll go through a few of these and highlight some of the aspects, but we're going to come back to some of these particular pumps a little later on. So let's look at the P-type ATPase. Now, this particular pump is utilizing, again, ATP and utilizing that phosphate group to cause a three-dimensional structural change in the pump system to allow the transportation of various molecules through a membrane. So it's a ATP-driven cation transporter. And the interesting thing is that we can go through phosphorylation and dephosphorylation. So we can actually change the physical three-dimensional structural shape of this particular catalytic transport system. So the protein phosphorylation causes a conformal change to either accept, deny, or open the particular transport system. Now, these all have a particular high level of amino acid homology, particularly in the regions where basically it's going to have the capacity to move through the lipid membrane and form that transmembrane component pore, which might have a number of individual domains. Now, the interesting thing is it follows the same mechanisms we've seen with the enzymology as well with some of our receptor binding, that this transport can be actually inhibited by using analogs of phosphate, because it will still bind to the receptor, to the transporter, but then it will not be able to go through that individual change to cause the phosphorylation and dephosphorylation to cause the three-dimensional structural component. And in that case, the phosphate analog acts as an inhibitor, and it's most probably what we call a competitive inhibitor in regards to that phosphorylational event now being taken out of contention. And it will follow all the same kinetics that we've talked about in regards to the simple competitive inhibition model that we saw with enzymes and substrates. They have usually 10 membrane spanning protein domains, and we are going to look at two examples of those. The potassium sodium or sodium potassium ATPase, which is an antiporter for the transportation of sodium and potassium. So an antiporter, again, is something moving sodium out, and in this case at the expense of moving potassium in. So they're going two different directions. The uniporter of the calcium ATPase is just going to be moving calcium from one side to the other. And that example we're going to utilize again and bring more scope in regards to the IP3 receptor and the cascade we've seen with the IP3 diacylglycerol and the protein kinases in regards to making that concentration of calcium in the cytosol be variable and be controlled through these types of transport systems to mop up and move that calcium once it's been released by the endoplasmic reticulum, to move it all back into the endoplasmic reticulum to decrease the calcium concentrations in the cytosol. The interesting thing is we've come to a lot of understanding more recently in the last 10 years in regarding these types of P-type ATPase pumps in regards to ulcerations in the stomach, because we know some of these these P-type ATPases play a significant role in the pumping of protons into the stomach through a proton potassium ATPase and actually increase the concentration of those protons to give you the acidity in the stomach. So we have these particular ones which become a molecular target to decrease their secretion or their actions to decrease the concentration of protons in the stomach, i.e., the acidity in the stomach. So let's have a look specifically, though, at the sodium potassium ATPase. Now, in a cell, we have a particular environment which is established by these particular pumps. Using the lipid membrane as the barrier, the inside of the cell is usually going to be typically at 140 millimoles for potassium and 12 millimoles for sodium. This is in contrast to the extracellular or blood plasma component, where we see a complete flip in regards to the potassium concentrations and that of the sodium concentrations. So in this case, the sodium concentrations are, nearly 20, 30 times difference in regards to being 4 millimole compared to 140 millimole inside the cell. Same with the particular component of the sodium, 145 millimole compared to 12 millimole inside the cytosol of the cell. This particular change provides us a imbalance of charge distribution across the membrane, because obviously what we see is a deficiency in a charged state within the membrane to give it a negative charge. Obviously, in equilibrium, we want to see basically both these particular constituents become a equal positive charge across the membrane. But what we actually do is implement the utilization of these ATPases to ensure that this is never reached, that we actually get a membrane potential differentiation of 50 to 40 millivolts in comparison to both sides of the lipid membrane. So here we have a negative 60 to 50 to 70 compared to the positiveness on the outside. So to ensure this particular counterbalance is occurring is that, and this is a mistake here, there should be 3 sodiums going out and 2 potassiums coming in. And with that particular imbalance that's occurring, that is going to then give you a charge distribution of more positive charges on the outside versus the smaller number of positive charges in the inside, which then gives you the issue of relative polarity to be negatively charged. So in this case, ATP is hydrolyzed to move 2 potassiums in at the expense of 3 sodiums out. So there's a mistake there. I have to change that. It's 3 sodiums out. So this is an integral protein that does this with a number of spanning units, with the ideal component of the ATPase actually being on the inside, in the cytosolic side of the cell. So this is the driving system to allow that endergonic energy system to have an exergonic coupled reaction to allow this participation to occur. So as you can see, we pump in 2 potassium ions at the expense of 3 sodium ions out through this sodium potassium ATPase to give you this resting membrane potential differentiation in regards to the negativeness inside the cell compared to that of the outside cell in regards to the barrier that the lipid membrane has provided, and only transportation of a charged state being able to go through these particular transport systems. So overall, it's an electrogenic process where basically we see the membrane establishing a potential difference between the 2 leaflets. So negative 70, and that's inside respect to the outside. So the negativeness is in the inside. Now, obviously, this can change in the action potential propagation if we're opening up ion channels to allow, hopefully, get to equilibrium by now changing the number of positive negative ions coming in the distribution to match that on the outside of the individual cell. And therefore, we can go to a resting membrane potential of 0 volts and even go positive if we're adding more positive ions in. And they might also be a electroconduction there in regards to moving a charge distribution change within the cell. So we can actually flip this particular, we'll go from positive to negative, and then we'll actually increase the positives inside here to get to 0, and then we might even have more positive charges in here in regards to now this has become more positive and this becomes then more negative outside. So again, we'll talk a little bit about that when we look at the action potential propagation. The reason I really want to stress this particular system is because this little sodium potassium ATPase accounts for 25% of all the energy that we make in regards to its consumption. This is so important to establish this membrane potential differentiation by just moving potassium and sodium selectively through a ATPase, an ATP consuming protein transporter. So 25% of all our energy that we consume is to establish this electropotential gradient between membranes of cells. So here's a little illustration of what the overall reaction's occurring. So here we have ATP and enzyme number 1 basically being phosphorylated to produce enzyme state number 2, and that ADP, that enzyme 2, which is now phosphorylated, is going to be then hydrolyzed by molecular water. So again, water playing a role in as a chemical reactant, regenerating enzyme 1, but also releasing the inorganic phosphate. So this is the type of cycle we will see happening through the process of phosphorylation and dephosphorylation with the utilization of molecular water and the release of inorganic phosphate. And we can actually summate this all the way through to have cancelling off the various components that are present on either side of the reaction to formulate a simplified reaction where we see ATP and molecular water giving us ADP and inorganic phosphate, or PI. So again, this becomes a very important role in this phosphorylation between enzyme 1 and which is not phosphorylated, and enzyme 2 that is phosphorylated, because the process of transportation involves a membrane protein and involving a conformational three-dimensional structural change initiated by the addition of that phosphate group to the enzyme. So let's have a little look at what happens with one of our systems here. So here we have a transmembrane protein and the associated various proteins that are going to do the work in regards to translating and moving calcium from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane. But as you can see, it goes through a number of incremental steps. It's not just a simple, there you go, calcium, you're all the way through because there's ATP bound. There is a controlling mechanism at every individual step of this particular system. So here we have E1. So the enzyme number 1 is going to be primed. It's ready for the calcium to move through. There might be in this case, it might be going against a calcium gradient in regards to there might be high concentrations of calcium that want to come into the cell or into the vesicle or even organelle. But this system is going to consume ATP and push that calcium through. But what it actually does, it does it in a number of discrete steps. So here we have first, the calcium binds to the domains within the the enzyme number 1. But this only occurs once the phosphorylation occurs of the enzyme because it produces a three-dimensional structural change. So here's ATP coming in. It is then going to actually produce a complex. And again, we talked this issue about magnesium playing a role in coordinating those phosphate groups. But this one has an ADP. It's already been hydrolyzed, but it still has the phosphorylational component occurring on this P component of the enzyme. So it gives us basically the EP, the E1P phosphorylational version. It's a bit like what we saw previously with the actin and myosin system, where the phosphorylation has to be covalently interlinked with the myosin head to allow it to interact with the actin dimer. And that particular release of that phosphate then changes the conformational change to cause then its release. So let's see what's going on here now. We have the system where we're going to see the P domain now be phosphorylated and coordinated, but we've still got the whole system closed. Now, once what we see here is where we're going to see the stroke motion in regards to now the release of the calcium and a rearrangement of the protein in the cytosolic side in regards to now the release of the ADP. But we still have a phosphorylation on the P domain to contend with. Once we start seeing that transformational change and the repriming of the system, we push the calcium out. We're now going to reprime the domain or the transmembrane component from E2P to now cause the release of the phosphate to give us E2. With that E2 release, we now have the P domain now being empty and being ready to be put into a new position in regards to now opening up to a new ATP moiety and the movement of additional constituents of calcium through. But notice what occurs in regards to the opening of the membrane as you go through the transition through the transmembrane protein. So at the moment it's closed, even though it's primed with calcium, and it's open in the process of what we see is this transitional component with removal of ADP to cause then the release of calcium from the system. And then we need to see that reprimed back again to allow us E2 to then be basically in a position to transition back to E1 by putting the individual domains in the right position to then accept more calcium ions. So again, we're now relinking the issue of phosphorylation and dephosphorylation to protein structural conformational changes, and in this case, the utilization of transporters to move calcium outside from one side of a membrane to another in regards to its transportation. Now, most of these particular types of ATPases actually follow a very distinct homology in their structure, form, and function. So here we have a number of illustrations of a calcium ATPase, a sodium potassium ATPase. We have the membrane potassium ATPase, that's the one that we see in some systems, particularly in the mitochondria, and we'll talk about this guy later on. But we also see this one, the gastric proton potassium ATPase, that's the one I talked about in regards to stomach ulcers. But they all basically contain a number of common elements. They have a number of transmembrane domains that form alpha helices that form the actual channel component. We have a system here, a acculator domain, which basically primes the system. We have a phosphorylation domain, and importantly, this nucleotide binding domain. That's where we're going to see ATP being bound, but the phosphate group going to the phosphorylation on the P domain or the phosphorylation domain to cause that three-dimensional structural change. So again, we have this commonality in our ATPases, and there has to be then some level of selectivity that's being caused to allow only this type of calcium to come through. This one has an exchange of a co-transporter of potassium and sodium. This one has one with just protons, and this one has potassium and protons moving through. So there has to be some level of also within this particular structure a process of selecting between these particular ions to move through in and out, but all requiring this nuclear binding domain and the phosphorylational domain to do its particular job. So here's the nuclear binding domain, the P domain, and the A domain in regards to the acculator, in regards to basically priming the whole reaction. But the main work is happening here through the process of phosphorylation, which is giving you the exergonic energy transfer to then move the molecules through to the system from one side to the other. So we know a lot about these potassium sodium ATPases, and we know this from history. A guy named Winthorpe many years ago, about in the late part of the 1800s, so the 17th, 17th, 18th century, 1700s, uh, was seen to basically saw an analogy in regards to a witch's brew that would combat a vascular system which they called dropsy. Now, dropsy we now know as congestive heart failure. Now, dropsy or congestive heart failure is characterized by significant edema in the peripheral system, meaning the peripheral arms and legs. Now, you might see people walking around which their legs look like, they're massive, particularly their ankles, very thick like tree trunks. They're suffering mostly from congestive heart failure in regards to their lymphatic system, which is a part of the circulatory system. So we have a lymphatic system and a circulatory system to move things through. What happens, sometimes we don't have the capacity to move things through and distribute them equally through the body. Because of the issue of gravity, things drop and basically cause an accumulation of fluid in those particular areas, particularly, as I said, in the ankles and the lower limbs. So that's why they call it dropsy. Now, how do you know if you've got edema? Okay, if you've worn your sports socks, right, and you've taken your socks off, and you see the kind of imprint that the sports socks leave on your ankle, that's because basically over a period of time, you're going to get some level of swelling. So you might have heard people, I've had a hard day on my feet all day, standing all day, and my feet are swollen, because basically they're accumulating fluid. Put your feet up, elevate it, rest, bed rest, will cause then the equilibrium and the movement of those fluids back through the system, and then hopefully dissipate the edema. But with people who have this type of situation, you can push the tissue, and where you put your finger and you release it, there still will actually be a hole there, which will then very slowly come back to a normal tissue surface without a dimple, and that's called edema. So there was a compound that Winthrop devised or saw, and they didn't know the science behind it. They just saw the accolade information in regards to people who are drinking this tea made from purple foxglove, this plant here, basically was actually improving their return to inhibit dropsy or inhibit the accumulation of fluids. And we now know within within the purple foxglove, there is a compound called digitalis, and this is what we call a cardioglycoside. This particular glycoside is known as digoxin, and it's actually three carbohydrates and a glycon, which basically represents a similar structure to a sterol. So it's very soluble into the lipids. What it does, this compound does, it actually inhibits the sodium potassium ATPase transport system by basically inhibiting the movement of loss of potassium, particularly in the heart cells. With that loss of potassium, we see then an increase of sodium. So if you think about our exchange system that's normally occurring, we're going to see then an increase in sodium inside the heart cells. With that major increase of sodium in the heart cells, which is bad for the heart cells, another pump is activated and basically becomes a major component to mitigate and minimize the sodium concentration in the heart cell. This is actually through a sodium calcium ATP pump. So what we do, we trick this particular sodium calcium ATP pump to take the role of the sodium potassium ATPase to remove the increased concentration of the sodium that's now in the heart cells and exchange that for an increased calcium concentration in the heart cells. With that increased calcium concentration, given that we've tricked the cell to utilize the sodium calcium pump, that particular calcium concentration enhances myocardial or heart cell contraction. With that particular increase of contraction, we get more force in regards to the capacity to generate higher blood flow and circulation without the without the increase of molecular oxygen consumption. So basically, we're refining the cell system by tricking it to do something else by increasing its calcium levels. So what happens in this particular process? We will see digoxin basically slow the heart rate down, but increase the capacity of being able to fill and contract and remove and increase the cardiovascular output. With this, we increase the circulational capacity. We have the capacity to keep the flow moving in regards to seeing a less accumulation of fluids in the peripheral limbs, particularly in the legs, and therefore combat the process of congestive heart failure. So we're using both the contractibility of the heart, the strength of the heart, by tricking it by inhibiting the sodium potassium ATPase to activate the sodium calcium ATPase to increase the calcium in the tissue, which then provides greater contractibility. Why don't we do this all the time? Because this is the way evolution has arisen to provide us a secondary system to combat if a particular system is deficient or problematic, in this case, the potassium sodium ATPase. We just utilized that particular analogy and enabled us to work to get contraction. Now, the important thing is with digichalis or digoxin is actually it's highly poisonous. So it has what we call a narrow therapeutic index. So if you take too much of this, it's going to kill the transport systems, all of them, and basically cause you to die. So don't go out and just drink and chew on a load of these purple foxgloves because you'll most probably kill yourself. It was Winthrop who basically devised how many of these plants you needed to put into a cup of tea. Because remember, they had no FDA or CDC back then. They had no experimental protocols or ethics in regards to dealing with human being subjects. Obviously, he lost a few patients because he basically poisoned them, and that's actually how basically we established the need for ethical control of drug testing. But again, this is nearly 300 years ago in regards to that observation. So let's have a look at the P-type calcium pumps. So if we think about these guys, we've already been introduced to those in the endoplasmic reticulum for our IP3 system. So in this case, we want to move this massive release of calcium that is in the cytosol, maybe because of the opening of the IP3 receptor. And we're going to do that by utilizing these P-type calcium pumps to decrease that concentration. So they're continually working to suck up the calcium in the cytosol and move it into an organelle, in this case, the endoplasmic reticulum. But we're going to go through the process of pumping these particular ions out using this ATPase, which then illustrates a plasma membrane calcium pump. The endoplasmic reticulum and the saccharoplasmic reticulum are highly abundant with these particular pumps because their role and job is to basically store that calcium store and use it when it needs its nutrient for signaling. So there's a number of proteins that need to cycle through different types of structures in regards to allowing you to have this particular process and move the calcium through. So here we have, remember this time, this is the cytosol, this is the whole cytosol, but this is an organelle in regards to the endoplasmic reticulum. So we have the lumen of the endoplasmic reticulum and the cytoplasm. So here we have the high concentration of calcium here, and we're going to have a calcium binding site. So we're going to have calcium coming into this alpha helical pore, which is kind of, encompassed by a number of alpha helices and providing that pore. It's going to bind to that particular site. But the problem is we need to distinguish between a high affinity and a low affinity site to get that calcium to move through that particular membrane. And we do that through a process of phosphorylation. So we have phosphorylation occurring first to produce a high affinity binding site on the cytoplasmic site. So we're going to phosphorylate in the P domain. So here we have our phosphorylation ATPs coming in. ADP has then been present with phosphorylation being contained and not being released until we see the movement of this transition of structural conformity to allow now the change of this binding site and also its occlusion, so shutting off, and now allowing it to become a low affinity binding site to now cause the release of the calcium through into the lumen of the endoplasmic reticulum. So in this case, we kind of are rocking between a high binding and a low binding site and occluding the interactions of any more calcium or other elements as a process of phosphorylation and dephosphorylation. So again, phosphorylation produces the high affinity site, which allows us to bind calcium on the cytoplasmic side. We see a conformational change here, occluding or stopping, blocking a particular pore, so nothing else can get in there. That calcium is still bound. And then we go through the dephosphorylation, releasing phosphate group, releasing the ADP, mostly releasing the ADP first, as we saw previously, and then releasing the phosphate group, and then basically twisting this molecule again, this structure around again, to then produce a low binding site, which then basically will then flood into the endoplasmic reticulum, and then regenerate, ideally, go through another cycle and regenerate the binding site, ready for the binding also in the P domain of the phosphate group to go through the structural change. And it actually shows us there is actually these little changes that occur with the protein in regards to doing the individual function of one binding the P domain with the phosphate ATP, then making the ADP PI, that phosphate still attached, that articulating domain moving its particular position, causing a structural change within these alpha helices to then give us the high and the low domains in regards to their affinities. So again, I'm trying to illustrate the issue of protein structural change. Now, phosphorylation, integrating a high and low binding site energies, and this is all due to three-dimensional protein structural change. And again, if we have mutations within these structures or the insertions of D amino acids, which are going to disrupt the structure of this particular protein, whether it be in the A, N, or P domain, or even the binding site of the ATP, we are going to cause dysfunction and basically prohibit the actions of this particular system. So we're looking at this issue of mediated conformational changes upon phosphorylation. And as I said, the simple phosphorylational event with that negative charge being added to the protein and causing a change in ionization to cause a conformational structural change has resonance throughout the number of cytoplasmic domains and ultimately infecting the transmembrane domain in regards to doing its job in selectively binding high affinity sites for calcium and changing those high affinity sites to low affinity sites to cause the release of calcium into the endoplasmic reticulum. So pretty amazing in regards to the machinery that we are utilizing in regards to the engineering, the movement of protein structure and its transition of movement and impact on other structures that give you this capacity to have a functional protein to do a particular job. Now, the F-type ATPases, and we're going to come back to these a little later on when we look at the production of ATP. These particular components use the same situation in regards to using a co-transportation of a proton group to give you the movement of this proton group against a chemical gradient or even a electrochemical potential gradient, depending on what we're looking at. But we have this kind of core component that basically places the head of the V1. So this is actually a number of subunits, A, B subunits. We're going to talk about these a little later on. And then we have a delta arm, or in this case, a delta arm with a B2, basically providing the capacity to move this thing through to allow the movement of hydrogens from one side to the other at the consumption of ATP. So I bring it down to the analogy of using like a pistol in regards to the trigger is the ATP, and what we're seeing is the revolving barrel come through, spitting out the hydrogen ions on one particular side. But in some of the systems, particularly in the mitochondrial F type ATPase, we have a level of reversibility, and we're going to see this become a very important role in making ATP. So these guys are our sole producers in making or one of our sole producers and major producers in making ATP in the mitochondria, and it uses a proton gradient to drive the production of ATP, or we can consume ATP to drive the production of the proton gradient. So let's have a look. So here we have ATP in the black line. We're going to consume ATP, make ADP and PI. This causes a conformational change in this whole process and a rotation. And we're going to see this later on. But what we're actually seeing then with this rotation, the selective binding of protons and moving them through into the mitochondrial matrix lumen to be stored at a later stage. And this is then vice versa. If we want to make ATP, we can take the red component, driving that proton through the ATPase, and take ADP and PI, inorganic phosphate, and actually condense those to make ATP. So this is an illustration of a reversible ATPase in regards to being driven by a proton gradient to either consume ATP to make that proton gradient, or utilize that proton gradient in the opposite direction to consume ADP to make ATP. So again, this reversibility becomes very important. So have a look on page 416. So phosphate, hydrogen ions or protons driven by the hydrolysis say it again. Protons driven by the hydrolysis of ATP is in the process of moving those protons in, and we can reverse that reaction. We can have the protons can drive the force on formation of ATP in the out process. So these are commonly called and known as ATP synthases, and we will see a lot more of these and study these specifically when we look at the production of ATP in the mitochondria. So I want you to keep those in mind. Okay. We also have some interesting non-specific transporters, and these particular ones are very of significant interest in pharmacology, because what they actually do is they can actually cause some problems for us. So they're called ABC transporters. Now, these guys still consume ATP as a ATPase would do, but they basically have some non-specific domains for binding particular compounds. This is including amino acids, peptides, proteins, ions, lipids, bile salts, and importantly, drugs. So they basically have this non-selective binding domain. They consume energy. They cause a conformational structural transformation, changing a high affinity state to a low affinity state, and then causing the release of the molecule through. We've already looked at this guy. It's a flipase. But this one is a little bit more complex in regards to binding, causing a phosphorylational event to occur. The drug comes in, binds also, the dephosphorylation occurs, opens up the pore, and allows the molecule to move through. So again, the molecule can't normally move through the lipid membrane. It has to go through these non-specific transporters. So all ABC transporters have these two nucleotide binding domains where we saw the issue of you consuming ATP. They hydrolyze one ATP molecule to transport it out of the cell or into the cell, depending on which way they go. Now, the problem is with these particular non-specific transporters, they are problems in getting drugs into cells because they combat the normal capacity to move drugs into the cell by concentration gradients. But as a transporter, what they're doing, they're actually taking that drug out of the cell. So the idea is we have to combat some of these, and sometimes we use inhibitors to actually impact these transport systems to enable the concentration of certain drugs in cells. So with drug therapies and targeting, particularly in cancer, we have to combat this normal movement or the normal biological movement of transport materials outside or from the cell itself, because ideally we want to get some particular drugs at a high concentration in a cell to target those particular pathologies and diseases in those types of cells, but we need to be able to then combat some of these particular transport systems that work counterintuitively and in the wrong direction in regards to bringing that concentration of those drugs into those cells to the appropriate therapeutic level. We also have a secondary active transport system for ion gradients. Now, these are known as the rocking bananas. So think of a banana just rocking on its side. That's what it's basically doing. It's doing one thing and another in regards to moving a particular proton through a system. In this case, we have a ion gradient of protons and sodiums which need to be driven to the other side and with various solutes. So we use those concentration of those solutes to allow us to move those particular constituents also in. So again, here we have a membrane potential propagational component where the potential protons, which are outside giving you this positive charge on the membrane, want to come in to the negative side of the individual membrane because they want to counterbalance this particular guy and neutralize the electropotential gradient. So what we actually do, we use a co-transporter, a permease, which basically allows a sugar to come in, a lactose. And what we can see is the capacity of this lactose to be selectively moved through the ion channel only with the movement of the resulting proton ion. Because of the high proton gradient differentiation, the protons are going to quite happily move through to try and get to equilibria, but importantly, they're going to also carry with them the lactose constituent. So lactose transport in E. coli does both the proton and lactose and enter the system with a co-transporting component. But we need to also then deplete these protons in the cytosol of the cell to allow us to maintain this electropotential gradient. Because if we started getting to equilibria and we started changing the charge distribution to become zero, the transportation of lactose will cease because there's no further movement of that hydrogen ions into the cell. So in this case, we're going to have to deplete the incoming protons to maintain this cycle process in regards to the continual movement of lactose into the cell. And we do this by using a proton pump. Now, this one is going to take a fuel substance. It could be carbohydrates, it could be fats, it could be specifically ATP. And it's going to basically utilize mostly the carbohydrates and fats, produce carbon dioxide, but it's going to take those particular protons out and transport them across the membrane via the proton pump to supplement and to increase and maintain the high concentration of protons on the extracellular surface to give us that particular charge differentiation of being highly positive. The interesting thing is we can stop this system quite easily, again by using cyanide. So by stopping this particular pump, we're going to see the increase of hydrogen ions in the cytosolic region and therefore change the ion distributional change to be equilibrium, therefore inhibiting the movement of hydrogen ions and thus the increased concentration and movement of the galactose from the outside to the inside. So we have this capacity to link particular transport systems to one another. So this again, a proton pump versus a co-transporter utilizing a proton gradient. What we actually see here, we have the actual system here. We know what it looks like because we've got three-dimensional structural analysis of this in regards to how the protein actually opens and closes. So at the moment, the protein transmembrane constituent for the transporter is actually closed, and we're going to have the protons come through, and as well with the lactose being actually bound to the transporter. So this is going to be a high affinity state for that particular transporter, attracting that lactose and being bound. What we then see is a conformational change in regards to now the movement of those protons through and allowing us now to open up this particular cavity on the opposite side where the lactose is now bound. But we also induce a low affinity state to then cause the release of that lactose to actually then move into the periplasmic space of this organelle. So again, we have this capacity. This is why they call it the rocking banana. It's like this or like that, rocking like this, in regards to these transporters having a cavity that will bind a substrate, cause the change in this affinity as it transitions through a three-dimensional structural change to then cause this release. So again, We utilize these particular proton gradients and proton pumps, in this case as a secondary active transporter, to move things against a ion gradient. Glucose and sodium. So this is really important for our study when we start looking at glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. We consume glucose and we need to get it into the circulatory system in regards to a movement of this particular constituent, its circulation and its storage. But let's look specifically at the movement of glucose from our digestive tract to that of the circulatory system. So sodium and glucose are transported through a symporter, where glucose basically is co-transported with that of sodium. So this is why it's very important to look at your sodium, calcium, your potassium levels when you do a full metabolic screen. And so these are very important things to kind of think about in regards to low sodium or potassium levels. Most people have high sodium levels just because of our diet components. So here we have the intestinal lumen with these atypical surfaces to increase the surface area. And in there we have transporters that will have the capacity to move both sodium and glucose through, and at a very high efficiency, and they are driven by the high concentration of sodium extracellularly. So what we see is a low sodium concentration being present, and basically we see that coming in and allowing basically the sodium to accumulate, and ideally the glucose to be now within the epithelial cells. This is where they part company in regards to trying to establish that movement of sodium through, because if we had an increased sodium concentration here, we're not going to get the movement. We want to actually decrease that sodium concentration, and we use our old friend, the potassium sodium ATPase, to do that, where we're going to use and consume ATP and see an exchange of, again, 2 potassium molecules in and 3 sodiums out. And in that case, we'll see a charge differentiation, so that will account for why the sodium wants to come in. We see a depletion of sodium in the equilibrium stage, where basically also we want to see sodium come in. So you can see this sodium then becomes a driving force with this co-transporter or symporter to allow the glucose to come in. As the glucose concentrations increase in the epithelial cells, we need then to remove that glucose out selectively to the bloodstream. And in this case, we use our GLUT2 transporter. It's very similar to a GLUT1 transporter. It does the same kind of thing. So basically, it works down a efflux concentration, very similar to what we saw in regards to the response in the red blood cells, where we're going to see basically if there's any glucose in these particular cells, we're going to see glucose come out, quite actively transported out through the GLUT2 transporter. This is a unitransporter to then basically concentrating or removing from the lumen of the intestine to the transportation of glucose to the blood system, which then will either be combated with glycogen or glucagon or insulin to see where it's going to be going into the cells where it's needed for metabolism. So this is an illustration now of multiple transport systems working together to do an overall job. So we've already talked about the unitransporters, we've talked about the co-transporters, and the symporters in regards to now understanding the concentration driven by the deficiency of sodium within the epithelial cells through an exchange system of the sodium ATPase, and then the associated movement of the glucose in regards to a downward flux, causing us important absorption of glucose from the intestinal lumen, from our diet, to actually getting into the circulation, which is then going to be taken up as if it's not in equilibria, going to be taken up by the red blood cells and allow them to basically have an equilibrium component of glucose in blood and in red blood cells, when those red blood cells are then going to act as a backup to buffer any changes in glucose levels. Okay. Now, we also have another family of protein transporters that are proteins, I should say, and these are ion channels. So these are highly selective, rapidly moving transmembrane proteins. And I mean moving in regards to opening and closing, in regards to accepting their ions and moving those ions through based on chemical gradients, but mostly related on electrochemical gradients. So we have two types of ion channels. One that was a ligand gated ion channel, meaning we've talked about ligands, we talked about protein binding. We now are going to talk about receptors and pores that give us this capacity to have the ligand protein binding complex, the KD, the KA, the psi number, and everything else in regards to the number of these types of receptors being expressed. So this provides you a rapid flux of ions caused by the opening of a three-dimensional structure within the channel upon binding of a ligand. So we can differentiate between substrate and ligand. Substrates are more for enzymes and other systems. Ligands are more for ion channels. So in this case, what we see is a compound that basically binds to the structure to enforce a three-dimensional structural change of a particular transmembrane protein that would normally allow a particular selective ion to go through. Now, this can also occur, this change, in a separate family of receptors or ion channels in regards to voltage gated ion channels, where we've seen that positive and negative charge either side of the membrane at minus 60 to 70 millivolts. But we can see fluctuation and changes between that action potential, between that voltage difference to cause an action potential. And that action potential, that voltage difference, causes enough energy to cause a three-dimensional structural change, again, in the transmembrane protein to either open or close this. So voltage-gated ion channels are membrane proteins that are change their three-dimensional structure based on the voltage, causing a conformational change. And this could either open or close the ion channel itself. So here's an example. We talked about this guy, KCSA, this potassium sodium channel, a beautiful alpha helical structure of 8 individual alpha helices, 4 individual domains or identical subunits, forming basically a cone-shaped structure in regards to having a capacity to allow potassium selectively through the ion channel when the potassium channel is open. It has a selectivity filter in here, which basically is a number of charged amino acids, both positive and negative, which basically allow the potassium ion to be selectively filtered from the sodium, calcium, and all other ions in regards to its molecular size. So we have a competitor called barium, which basically, if you have a look, was it beryllium? I can't remember if it's barium or beryllium now. I think it's barium, where basically if you look on the periodic table, barium and sodium and potassium are very close together. They share a very similar molecular size. So we can actually bring potassium through, but also we can use barium to also come through because we can mimic the size of the potassium ion. The interesting thing is the potassium ion will only come through this particular ion channel if it's in its hydrated form. And so, therefore, there has to be some kind of energy requirement to get this potassium hydrated and move it through the pore. So, here's the pore of the ion channel. All these are different associated alpha helices to actually allow it to embed into the transmembrane component, to be the transmembrane component. So, again, as I said, when we look at these hydrophobicities, a lot of the hydrophobic surfaces are going to be those that are going to be on this kind of outside region, where the hydrophilic and the selective components of amino acids are going to be in that pore region. So again, where we see our amino acids being interactive may not be all in the parallel part of the sequence, so they might be not after each other. If you think about the alpha helix going around our kind of core component, and all the amino acids are on this side, it means that every 3.4 or 3.6 amino acid is going to be an important one to be facing maybe a hydrophobic domain or a hydrophilic domain in regards to its orientation and specific structural alignment, also with other alpha helices. So again, this whole combination of structure to get the right dimensions and components in the right orientation, whether it be the outer core of the hydrophobic to interact with the alkyl chains of the fatty acids that make the lipid membrane, or the orientation of surfaces to allow you to produce a pore of a charged or non-charged or selectivity filter to allow molecules to come through to actually go through the lipid membrane. So again, it's really important to understand some of the aspects in regards to the three-dimensional structure of these transmembrane proteins to give you this capacity to cause particular movement. So we know a lot of structure about these particular ion channels. So here's KCSA again, and it's not this case just a situation of having, sorry, this is not KCSA, this is actually a human potassium ion channel where basically using the model of KCSA, we can start kind of figuring out, because KCSA is very basic, but we can start adding all the additional components of structure that we know that are normally formulated in these particular types of potassium channels. Yes, so here we have potassium coming through in its hydrated form, and then we have these types of other elements within the domains in the cytosolic component that can provide a process of regulation. And in this case, we have couple of domains here, these parts here, the S4, sorry, here's the S4 here, the S4, I think that's the S4 there. These guys are really important because they are what we call the voltage sensing domains. So depending on the charge distribution on the membrane, so if this is a positive charge and this is a negative charge, it's going to cause a different orientation of the S4 domain. And with that S4 domain change, so it actually moves up or it moves down. And with that movement up and down, it either opens the hole or closes the hole. So think of a bit like an iris on an old-fashioned camera, where you can close the hole really tightly and open it up really big to let the light in. That's the same process that we see in these types of ion channels. We can see it a little bit more from the top of the ion channel itself. So here we have an open ion channel in regards to allowing that potassium to come through. And here we have a conformational change in regards to the positioning of those positive charged voltage sensors, which then change the ultimate structure of the pore domain to cause its closure. So these guys, once we become highly positively charged, this becomes highly negative charged, these guys are going to move in or out depending on the charge distribution on the membrane to give us that kind of closing and opening. And that then becomes a voltage-gated membrane. So again, a little difference from what we've seen with other systems. Now, just note, a voltage-gated membrane can also have a ligand interaction with, let's say, a toxin. So we have this thing working with voltage sensing, opening and closing based on the membrane potential voltage. But we can still use a toxin as a ligand to prohibit, in this case, maybe the movement of the S4 domain, this voltage sensing domain, to keep the ion channel closed, meaning no longer having a flux of potassium coming through the membrane. So again, we have these enormous kind of structural identities that we need to integrate in our theory and understanding about how action potentials work, and in the sense of voltage gating and ligand gating ion channels, and how they actually play a role in three-dimensional structural change, not occurring through phosphorylation, but occurring through the issue of voltage differentiation between a membrane or a structural change based on the binding of a ligand on a membrane, transmembrane protein, to cause a conformational difference. So, very complex. It's the whole area of neuroscience and pharmacology, which came from the area of biochemistry. In the old days, and still some ion channel receptors we can only kind of philosophize in regards to what they really look like through three-dimensional structural analysis. We can have these transmembrane constituents, again with voltage sensors, and we have, in this case, 4 individual domains, making a 1, 2, 3, 4 segmented coil, where basically here we have the transmembrane component, the voltage sensor, and the pore that allows the material to come through, in this case, sodium. But we also have these gate systems. So here we have a cytosolic protein, which is a gate inactivator. And this gate inactivator also plays a role in blocking or causing the ion channel to become restful in regards to a action potential propagation. Now, we'll continue our study on these ion channels on Monday. I will continue taking students through their exams. If you so wish, as I said, we can have A to I and J to